You got an egghead and a scientist, and you got some docs with a white coat on, and a chef, and some guy from agriculture, a farmer, somebody who does research in pigs or something like that. You would never think that the four disciplines are going to have something in common.
Yeah, it sounds like a knock-knock joke.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 202nd episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to improve, enhance, and otherwise facilitate the best workings of your own brain. In today's episode, we're going to be looking deeply at one of our senses. We've had a series with several episodes in the past called Know Your Neurotransmitters. This might wind up being something similar. The first episode dedicated to a particular sense. And today we're going to be looking specifically at the senses of taste and smell, how these senses combine to give us our sensory appreciation for food, something called neurogastronomy, a small field but a growing one, and one with some passionate advocates who we'll be hearing from in the coming interview. If you hang out until the very end of the episode, I'm going to tell you something you might not know about caffeine, probably the world's most popular cognitive enhancer, and how it can affect your other cravings. But for right now, let's kick things off first, as usual, with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So just a few episodes ago, in episode number 198, we talked with Dr. Dan Romer about the teenage brain. And even more recently than that, looked at historical performance by various groups of kids over the decades on the marshmallow test, and showing how decade by decade, kids seem to be getting better and better at that. So I feel like recently we've been putting a pretty positive spin on what's going on in teenage brains. The marshmallow test is obviously for kids younger than teens, but a young kid with a lot of self-control probably leads to a teen with a better than average self-control. But in the never-ending quest to improve teens, there is more and more interest all over the world in getting teens involved in meditation and mindfulness programs. In the UK, there is a big Mindfulness in Schools project that claims to have trained over 4,000 teachers now and counting in teaching mindfulness to their students. However, some recent findings are calling into question whether this is really ready for mass rollout yet, whether the actual techniques used in training teens in mindfulness are getting through to the kids and actually allowing them to achieve results. In some new research led by a team at Flinders University and published in the journal Behavior Research and Therapy, they dialed up what they thought would be a really optimal program for getting teens to use and benefit from mindfulness. This is based on a program with the catchy name .B, as in a period followed by the letter B, representing the stop and be technique, which involves stopping, feeling your feet, feeling your body progressively, feeling your breathing, and being present. Daily practice at home was encouraged, and in fact, they tried to really solicit help from the kids' parents as well, offering an initial parents' evening session to familiarize parents with what they were going to be doing as the program started, and sending the parents weekly YouTube clips of the child's training sessions. The researchers said they did not get a heck of a lot of participation from the parents, although it's hard to blame the parents if they're being sent YouTube videos of people meditating. The classroom teachers were also asked to participate alongside their students. The teachers also got improved course materials and colorful classroom posters, basically doing everything that they could think of to set up the program for success. There were 378 teenagers from 4 schools in Australia that took place in the 40 to 60 minute training sessions. Half of this group had their parents involved, the other half did not. That was randomly assigned. And there were also 182 teens from the same schools that participated in the study and that they were being measured, but they were the control group. They received no mindfulness training whatsoever. And all of these kids were 13 years old on average. As for where they were hoping to see improvements in the kids' lives, they used questionnaires and other evaluations to test the students' level of anxiety and depression, concerns about their weight, their overall well-being, and their levels of everyday mindfulness when they're not actually trying to be mindful. This was a 9-week program, and they tested the kids at the beginning and the ends of the program 6 months later and then 12 months later again, finding that despite their efforts, there was no discernible differences between any of the 3 groups, either immediately post-intervention or at the 6 and 12-month follow-ups, leaving the researchers, who are themselves big mindfulness advocates, wondering if perhaps they have just not found the right age to do an intervention like this, said Catherine Johnson. Further research is required to identify the optimal age, content, and length of programs delivering mindfulness to adolescents.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Jeremy Scott Killian from the USA says, as a philosopher of emotion, I'm really interested in the subject matter covered in this podcast for 2 reasons. Number 1, it provides very helpful interviews that inform me of the cutting-edge research in cognitive studies. And 2, as an academic in an incredibly competitive and demanding field, it's vital that I'm aware of the best strategies to optimize my cognitive performance. For someone like me, this podcast is a must listen. And listener Gormstorms, also from the USA, said with somewhat less passion but greater brevity, "Great show, I'm really enjoying my listens." Well, thanks to both of you. Thanks to everybody that's been leaving iTunes reviews or reviews elsewhere. If you've kind of been on the fence and thinking, hey, maybe I'll leave an iTunes review, but come to think of it, I have no idea how an iTunes review is actually left. Well, have we got just the thing for you? We've got at smartdrugsmarts.com/iTunes a little video that weighs in at only 44 seconds that will show you how to leave an iTunes review. So if you've got like a grand total of 2 minutes and 44 seconds when you're on the web and you want to do something for Smart Drug Smarts, that would be totally awesome. One of Smart Drug Smarts' sponsors, Vitamonk, is doing something for you this month. In their October surprise giveaway, they're going to be giving away a year's supply of anything on their shelf. That could be Alpha GPC, that could be their Adaptogen Mix, Adaptotrax, could be anything you take a fancy to. Signing up for that is easy, painless, and fast, and can be done at smartdrugsmarts.com/October. As you may guess from that name, that's a contest that's only going on through the end of the month of October. So as you're disrobing from your Halloween costume, the chances of getting in on that will be coming to an end, so act fast. Smart Drug Smarts has a newsletter. We call that the Brain Breakfast. Put out something last week, which was a little bit related to the Columbus Day holiday that we just had, but also to a book that I just read. Got turned on to that by a friend that I grew up with who's actually a professional researcher, scientist, academic nerd. It just reminded me of how every little scientific discipline has these amazing things that the general public, including myself, doesn't know that these things are like, this is a known fact. This particular one was something in the field called biogeography. And if you scratch your heads, like, what is biogeography? I'm largely in that same boat, except that a guy that I grew up with happens to now be a biogeographer. But anyway, that's the kind of stuff that gets waxed on about in the Brain Breakfast. And if you want to get signed up for that, you can do so at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. Finally, a big thanks to our fine friends over at Axon Labs, home of the stacks Nexus and Mitogen, which I feel admittedly a little bit sheepish talking about on an episode about taste and flavor, because having bit into a capsule every now and then to see what it tastes like on the inside, can't really recommend the flavors of either Nexus or Mitogen, but as far as their actual ingredients, lots of good stuff in there. Nexus, brain-focused, Mitogen for cells throughout your body. Star compounds include things like aniracetam, sulbuthiamine, pycnogenol, bio-PQQ, and you can find both Nexus and Mitogen on the web at axonlabs.io.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So we're in one of those weird times where you can pretty much pick any human field of endeavor and put the word neuro on the front of it. And if nobody has done that yet, then you're very likely to be legitimately breaking ground on a new discipline. There are neuroeconomists, neuropsychologists, neuroendocrinologists, and now neurogastronomists. The overall neuro trend is on a strong upswing, and this really isn't just a fad. It's riding on the back of advances in technology, being able to actually look at brain data quantitatively and see what the relationships are between what a person might be doing in a specific field or discipline, and seeing what parts of the brain that might rely on or what parts of the brain are being affected by that. So neurogastronomy then is pretty much the scientific intersection of the brain and the stomach, and is kind of the place to be if you're both a foodie and somebody with a strong interest in neuroscience. What you're about to hear is actually 3 separate interviews woven together, 2 of whom are scientists and one of whom is a professional chef. And not just any professional chef, a professional chef whose unique brain is kind of the claim to fame for her within her industry. Taria Camarino is a chef and a synesthete. Synesthesia, we've talked about in previous episodes, is the rare, but not quite as rare as you'd think, commingling of one or more senses. Our sensory inputs are normally pretty clearly subdivided within the brain. If you're a synesthete, these perceptual walls are quite a bit more porous. Taria Camarino is rare even among synesthetes in that her synesthesia involves her sense of taste. She will tell us all about this in the main interview, including how she uses her commingled senses to increase her creativity as a chef. Of the scientists we're going to be speaking with are Tim McClintock, who is the Louis Boyarsky Professor of Physiology, and Dr. Dong Han, who is an Associate Professor of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at the University of Kentucky School of Medicine. Each of them are very passionate about the sense of taste, smell, and overall yum factor of food. And this is a lively interview, so get ready. You might want to have some food handy because you might be hungry by the end of this. But let's sit down to a big helping of Dr. Tim McClintock, Dr. Dong Han, and Taria Camarino.
The concept of neurogastronomy, the term itself was coined by Dr. Gordon Shepherd of Yale University, prominent neuroscientist of olfactory neurosciences. And that was done just about 10 years ago. And it was a call for scientists in different fields to come together and look at the questions and address the questions of neurophysiology of flavor perception from an interdisciplinary format. And that hasn't been done as well as we would have liked for years. Just in the last several years, that call and that challenge by Dr. Gordon Shepherd was answered by many different professionals from different fields. And we decided to form a society. And aptly, the name is the International Society of Neurogastronomy.
Kind of where foodies meet scientists, I guess.
Yes, and much more, as a matter of fact. I mean, that's where the draw is initially, but it really addresses questions about agricultural sustainability and different clinical aspects of smell and taste changes, not just in context of smell and change, but because of other disorders and how it could be utilized as a prodromal state so that you could make diagnosis, maybe use it as a treatment modality, or to even bring about some quality of life for those with impaired smell and taste.
I have no visual or auditory memory of any kind. So, like, now that I've seen your face, I actually can't remember it at all because I don't remember things that way. So I can watch the same movie 100 times, still not remember any part of it except food. So I can watch a food movie and remember it. I can remember the food scenes in movies that I've seen. And I remember things through taste. I mean, I can't draw because of that very reason. So I can't see a box in my head. I cannot visualize anything but food. And same with taste. So it's the same. I'm getting lots of experiences, but I don't necessarily have to remember all of them through flavor. But if I want to carry a memory, it's done through taste, through flavors. So all the different shades of blue, or all the different shades of green, or music, or emotions. So I'll feel an emotion, but if I want to communicate what that emotion feels like, I do it through taste. So thankfully, I decided to become a chef at 17 because food was all I really knew. I did not know how to communicate what was happening for me except through food. So even though I was having this experience, I didn't really fully understand it until I guess I'd been professionally cooking for about 3 or 4 years at that point, maybe even a little longer. And that's when it all started to kind of make sense to me, or it's like, oh my goodness, this is how I relate to everything. Then I started manipulating those flavors to create an experience for people. And once I really saw that that was possible, I just kept going deeper and deeper and learning so that I could then communicate it. So it's an interesting thing because I know that taste synesthetes are rare among synesthetes, but it's a little more complicated to me than just like, oh, something tastes like an Oreo, because an Oreo has flavor. So Oreos are very specific. They use a black cocoa powder, which has a very unique flavor profile. So an Oreo tastes like black cocoa. It tastes like a particular kind of fat. It tastes like powdered sugar. So it has all of these components that make up a flavor. So something doesn't taste like an Oreo per se. It tastes like black cocoa, powdered sugar, shortening, water. And so to be able to break that down to a much more simplistic understanding, I can then take particular flavors, combine them together in such a way using texture and technique so that you can then experience a song the way I experience it.
When we talk about human sense of smell, oftentimes it's sort of poo-pooed compared to other smellers out in the animal kingdom. Is sort of the conventional wisdom there right, that humans do have a conspicuously bad sense of smell?
The way that people usually phrase it, in that we are less sensitive, is usually for most smells not true. When it's carefully studied, we are as sensitive to low concentrations as other animals. There are a few known cases where that's not true. But mice are able to discriminate odors better than we are. Other animals are able to discriminate odors one from another better than we are. That is definitely true. I work on the receptor proteins and the receptor genes that actually interact physically with the odor molecules. And we have 400 of them. A mouse has 1,100, a rat has 1,200, a cat has 1,200, a dog has about 1,000, these receptor proteins, and therefore the same number of genes. In fact, it's the largest family of genes in your genome. More genes dedicated to these receptors that interact with odors than any other kind of gene, any other family of gene.
Actually, sense of smell is the best chemical detector in the human body. I mean, more so than any other senses. So it really gets shortchanged, and largely because, we just completely take it for granted. It's just like anything in life. You really don't understand how important it is until you lose it. And on my end, I'm a clinical scientist. I work work with a lot of patients with brain disease, whether it's head trauma, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, epilepsy, what have you. Sense of smell is part of the symptom clusters that really bother people. And even patients don't even think to talk about it until you ask them.
When we're talking about some of the other senses like vision or sight, there's a spectrum of wavelengths that we're responding. There isn't really an equivalent in olfaction, as I understand it, right? It's basically just a hodgepodge of different chemicals that you either can sense or can't.
Yeah, that's a very astute question. You're exactly right in that vision and hearing, their stimulus is a single dimension, wavelength of either light or sound waves. And smell is, the stimuli are multidimensional. Odors are multidimensional. They have different sizes, different shapes, and different chemical reactivities. There are at least 3 dimensions. And to put it in lay terms, but in scientific terms, we actually recognize hundreds of dimensions. And so it's a tough problem from that regard. They're not arranged in any logical order. 2 odor shapes and sizes may be very similar, but some odors are very distantly different from the next odor in shape or size.
So how do you go ahead and make a mapping or order the parts of the smell world that you have a better grasp on than others?
Well, we do the best we can with those 3 things, shape, size, and chemical reactivity in terms of ordering the odors. Your brain does it very well. And what we don't know, as much as we'd like, is how exactly does it do that. My part of trying to figure that puzzle out is to identify which of those 400 in a human or in a mouse, where we do most of our work, 1,100 receptors, which of them actually interact with an individual species of odor, an odor molecule, or a complex mixture of odor molecules. If you get 5 or 6 receptors that respond to odor A and 5 or 6 different ones that respond to odor B, what happens when you mix odor A and odor B? Is it just the sum and you get 12 receptors that respond, or is it some interaction? And unfortunately, for understanding the logic, it's always some sort of interaction. At least that's what we understand at this point. And that's why making a new fragrance, the people who are called perfumers have such a difficult job. The odors interact in unpredictable ways so that the patterns of receptors that respond aren't predictable from knowing what receptors respond to the individual components. We've known this for centuries. Perfumers do this trial and error process of, I want a base note in the smell, and I want something floral, and I want something that's sort of stinky to give it a little heft of the odor, and I want something a little bit of clean sensation to it. You put those together and it doesn't turn out the way you hoped, and they just have to try and try and try again.
It seems like the big 5 senses that we all learn as kids, probably smell and taste, get short shrift compared to vision and hearing and sense of touch.
Correct. But it's more than that, actually, because we're so cortically sight and hearing dependent. We completely take smell for granted and think that loss of smell really isn't a big deal until you lose it. And that's one thing. But just evolutionary biology itself really highlights the importance of smell. And before mammals, just how the species have developed over the years, one of very few neurophysiological underpinnings that gather all the species together is sense of smell, and how important that is for migratory patterns, chemoreceptive detection for poison, different types of threats for survival, so on and so forth.
When smell starts to fail in a person, does it kind of go out in stages, like where you're losing your hearing, you might lose some frequencies that you don't hear before others go out, or is it an all or nothing process?
So it depends, just like vision, just like hearing, it depends on the mechanism. So if you have a brain disease, whether it's Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease, the part of the brain that interprets senses, specifically for smell, that starts to deteriorate. And you're going to have that gradient of deficit that's going to be noticeable later on down the road. And most people don't even think about it when it starts. Versus, say, a car accident or head injury from football or falling down the stairs, what have you. If the part of the brain that's picking up the senses is impaired because of trauma, then you're going to have more of a sudden onset, acute changes in your smell. And usually people notice that much easier, and it does bother them pretty significantly, because it could heal over in an atypical way where your brain is still taking in signals. So instead of smelling appropriately, you're smelling all sorts of wrong things things, and people complain of smelling skunk 24 hours, so on. So you can imagine how disruptive that would be, to say the least. I'm being very diplomatic here.
Yeah.
Things like this, nobody even thinks about this until it happens. If you start to hallucinate, you see things, visual hallucinations happen, and people are not necessarily even bothered by them. But with smell, that's a whole other animal. There are a lot of cases where patients would have parosmia and they would smell foul things 24/7. They just can't turn it off. And it gets to a point where they actually become suicidal just to turn it off.
Wow.
They're very odd things that are out there that people don't think about until it happens. And as a clinician, I wanted to be a voice for those folks. And on the other end of the spectrum, wanted to be a voice for folks who has smell and taste impaired because of a condition and they can't enjoy a meal anymore. Vast majority of what you would consider taste is actually flavor, and 70 to 90% of that flavor perception is smell.
I did a dinner where I flavor profiled, which is what I call it. It's a flavor profile of something. And this was a band. It was at the Atlanta Contemporary Art Center. I did 9 courses. And the interesting thing about my experience is I get flavors that I've never tasted before. Like I'll get something that I've never even heard of. And then I have to research and figure out what it is. So the band played, but they played behind a curtain. By having them play behind the curtain, all they were left with was taste and sound. And one of the courses was a moss-flavored cotton candy that I'd never heard of. I didn't know what I was going to do, but it was a very specific type of moss because there's all types of moss that grow. So it was the kind of the moss that grows on the rocks by the river. So I was like, okay, what the hell am I doing now? Basically what I did was I went to the herbs shop and I just walked through and touched the herbs and then picked out the flavors that I knew would work. And then I made a moss cotton candy.
Luckily, it was an edible moss. I could imagine, if you listened to a metal band and you thought, oh, this sounds just like steel tastes. You can't just give people a meal made of steel wool or something.
No, but what you can do is incorporate things that are cold. So rock. I did a bourbon drink once and I froze pieces of granite and used that in place of ice. And it actually lends a cool stone-like quality to it. So you can manipulate things that are natural to create, because that's almost subtle, right? So for me, they're not subtle. It's very intense and big. When I taste granite, like I experience it, where another person, it's going to be more subtle for them. And instead, it's almost, an essence, I guess, is what you would say. The moss flavor wasn't intense, and I didn't even use moss. I used matcha and moringa. I used a little bit of thyme and a little bit of wheatgrass. So it was a combination of warm and cool and really green, but then also grays. So I combined these herbs that had those flavors to create that particular type of moss experience. There's probably a flavor for everything. There has to be. I have to believe there is, because you just walk into an Indian grocery store. You've got thousands of flavors going on. Just the types of rice there are. And each one of those has its own unique flavor. And the same with coriander, right? So you have coriander leaves, you have coriander seed, you have coriander root. They all have their own flavor.
Do the responses that one person gets to a smell compared to the next person, is there a logic or a predictability to that? There's certainly plenty of examples you can think of in probably your own kitchen where you might like the smell of something and somebody else in your family is like, oh, gotta get me away from that thing.
Those differences, we think, are learned associations. Farm boys like me, we don't mind that manure smells, at least at low and moderate concentrations. If you grew up inside a city, you might find them very offensive. So there's that component in terms of the value we put on what we smell. In terms of what's happening neurologically, the two people and the pattern of neural activity is probably not very different. We know that's pretty true across mice. The first connection from the nose into the brain, we know that those patterns are pretty reproducible.
Tell me about the methodology behind the mouse studies. What are you actually looking at there?
We invented a way to identify using living mice so that they're behaving naturally and smelling things naturally the way they do, in the real world. And we invented a way to identify which of the receptors respond in that situation. And we we did that because these receptor proteins don't behave well in culture systems outside their normal habitats in the nose, which we tried to do for about a decade, starting back in the 90s, and gave up on that and started working on ways to do that in vivo so that the receptors would behave normally. Things are happening. It's going to be an interesting future the next 20 years.
What do you foresee there as far as changes or advances?
I think it's analogous to what happened over the last 30 years in the pharmaceutical industry. If you're old enough like me, you could remember how bad some of the drugs were, like antihistamines. Everybody would fall asleep 30, 40 years ago. It's because we didn't understand the receptors in the body that were being blocked. And once we knew what the receptors in the body were that respond to histamine, the antihistamine drugs were able to be refined down so that they're only blocking the receptors that respond to histamine in the cells that are producing mucus. And that refinement, due to the discovery of the receptors and the ability to study the receptors, really helped the pharmaceutical industry make better therapeutic drugs. And so what's going to happen, I believe, is that the ability that we now have to understand which receptors respond to any odor is going to allow us to do a real pharmacology of the odor system. That means that the production of fragrances and flavors and what I call odor modifiers, which are primarily blockers of odors you don't want to smell. And let me tell you, there are lots of odors you don't want to smell.
Yeah, probably more that you don't than you do.
We're going to be able to develop those things in a logical fashion now that we have much better ways to study the receptors. Again, it's just the same thing that happened in the pharmaceutical industries, I think, going to happen in those industries.
When somebody is having their sense of taste or sense of smell go sideways, or they're getting a signal, but the signal is being misinterpreted, what does medicine have to offer them therapeutically? I mean, what treatment options are there?
Right now, very little. And that's why the International Society of Neurogastronomy was formed. One of our mission is to integrate all these fields so that people are forced to come out of their silos and to interact with other disciplines so that all of the information that's available in respective fields can be shared for translation and application of our knowledge base and artistic base so that we could make meaningful application out of this, like helping somebody who's not able to taste because of chemotherapy or something like that enjoy food again. And there are different ways to attack that outside of just pure smell, especially if your olfactory bulb is impaired because of neurotrauma or something, in a car accident or from a fall or stroke even. That mechanism has been affected because it's impaired from the mechanism of trauma. A lot of the times you can't undo those. However, there are other ways to maximize desired effects by utilizing other variables. We know through experimental sciences that certain colors make certain things taste sweeter or more bitter or more salty and so on. So that could be paired with ingredients and so on. And we know certain textures highlight certain taste a certain way or diminish certain taste a certain way. So you match all those data and then have agricultural technologists figure out what the most sustainable way to deliver that is. And then you satisfy the need of desired flavors. So it's not just at the individual level of clinical deficit. We would like to also use this for global health because it's our philosophy and my personal philosophy that much of production-related problems in the globe today that's contributing to food shortage by year 2050 for expected 9 billion people by then, it carries one common thread across cultures, which is our desire for certain flavors, because your mass production of crops and produce and yields are going to be dependent on market demand. So that market demand dictates the economy of certain types of produce, and those products are going to be what we as a species are going to demand, whether it's sweet, whether it's savory, or what have you. So if we're just constantly talking about inside the box thinking of how to meet that demand by producing yields this way versus that way, we're really not answering or solving any of the questions that's posed by sustainability issues.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really, really interesting approach and probably one that not a lot of people are thinking about, maybe outside of your circles. Do you foresee a future where lima beans or Brussels sprouts will be able to taste like ice cream and things like that, but still have the same nutritional qualities?
I enjoy those kinds of images. I'm not sure we'll get to that level, but yeah, we'll be able to make flavors and fragrances that are much more refined, and have them made for specific purposes, and it'll have an impact. And certainly what people who are involved in neurogastronomy are very concerned about the proper use of flavor in healthful eating. Because our sensation of flavor is linked to the reward systems in the brain, very easy to get hooked on flavors that are being put into foods that are really unhealthy for you to eat in large quantities. What we'd love to see is developing preferences for flavors or transferring flavor preferences to things that are healthy. There are going to be numerous ways in which the use of flavor and manipulating flavor are going to help the developed world, like the United States, be better eaters, eat more healthfully. My wife and I are reading Roy Blount Jr.'s book, Save Room for Pie. And in the first chapter, he makes this comment: primarily eating a healthy diet is like marrying for money. Good results, but you may not be emotionally satisfied.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of truth to that when it comes to flavor. Flavor is what a scientist would call an emergent property. It's actually a synthesis, an integration of multiple senses. We see the food on the plate. We have an anticipation of what it's going to taste like based on what it looks like or how it's presented. We start manipulating it. It has a feel in our hands, and then we put it in our mouths. It has a feel there. There's touch involved. There is a characteristic sound that goes with what you're eating, a sound that you probably have learned to expect. A potato chip, a stick of celery, you get crunchy sounds versus other kinds of sounds from softer foods. And then, of course, there's the taste, which is very simple and very basic. Those 5 things: salt, sweet, bitter, sour, and savory, which the Japanese call umami. That then happens in the mouth. But as you're chewing that, and as you exhale over the food, it goes up into the nose, the volatiles off of it, and you smell the food. And that smell of the food is actually the most powerful part of flavor. But flavor is the integration of essentially all the senses. And so it's this complex interplay. Even though the most powerful component of flavor is the smell of the food, you don't actually realize that that sensation is being detected in your nose. Flavor, your brain tells you, is in your mouth, even though most of the sensation is actually in your nose. It's an illusion, but it's a useful one because that's where the source of the volatile molecules that you're smelling are in the flavor. The source is in the mouth. So the brain is telling you conscious awareness that, okay, here's that flavor that you like or don't like. It's in your mouth. Swallow it or spit it out.
Yeah, that's kind of intriguing. Because you can see where the learned association picks up. You're mashing some food around in your mouth and you experience this flavor in your brain, but there's always a one-to-one correspondence between the mashing the food around in your mouth and getting the sensation. There's no corresponding movement going on actually within our smell system, and we don't need to wiggle our nose to smell or anything. So it starts to feel what's happening is happening in our mouth.
We pay so much attention about the conscious part of that flavor sensation, but there's also that unconscious part, especially with the smell that's part of the flavor. The smell is linked very closely with the limbic system and therefore the emotional response that we have to food and other fragrances for that matter. And we understand not nearly enough about what happens when odors or flavors are activating the emotional centers in the brain and what that does to our behavior. Did I marry the woman I married because I like how she smells? That's quite possible. That had a lot to do with it. We don't know enough about those things.
In the research sphere, what could we know about the way that the brain processes taste, smell, flavor that we don't know right now that might make some of these potential therapies possible in the coming years?
It's interesting you asked that because, one, it's a very good question, but there is already an answer that many people don't think to look for. The neurophysiology of how flavor mechanism works, it's actually quite well thought out. There's a lot of information already in existence thanks to the works of neuroscience giants like Dr. Gordon Shepherd, Tim McClintock, Barry Green, Gary Beauchamp, Stuart Firestein. These are the folks who are in the field of neurosciences that's been working on how smell mechanism works and how flavor mechanism works for years now. But there's a problem because it's not unusual that that your question gets posed. And it's not because the information's not out there. It's simply because people have not been challenged to think a certain way in terms of flavor perception and how neuroscience of flavor actually can have effects for positive change in humanity beyond making candy taste better.
What are some of the other misconceptions that people have about the senses of flavor, olfaction, things like that?
One that I hear a lot is that people have misconceptions about how badly the sense of smell deteriorates with age. It does, but in sort of a biphasic way. The average person's sense of smell gets worse with age very, very gradually and not very much at all over the first 80 or 90 years of life. The decrement is really quite small when it's measured carefully. People over 80 or so, 80, 90, 100, do you begin to see typically sharp decrements and decreases in their ability to smell. And there are hypotheses about why that is true, but I'm not aware that we know for certain why it's true. Whether it's out in the nose or in the brain, probably a combination of things. People also think that smell doesn't matter. They think that losing their sense of sight or hearing have a much bigger impact on their life. And it's true, losing either one of those does have a big impact. But people who become anosmic, who lose their sense of smell later, after they become adults, for example, often have pretty big emotional problems, really affect some of them very much emotionally. I have a friend who's a psychologist, studies the sense of smell. She thinks that the incidence of attempts of suicide in people who lose their sense of smell is just as high as the increase in people who lose hearing or sight because of the emotional effects of losing that sense of smell. And a lot of that probably has to do with flavor. Food is such a big part of our lives. We get pleasure from that, hopefully, every day, as long as you don't have a bad cold.
When you were talking about how the sense of smell decrements with age, I was thinking that maybe it would be producing more mucus or something like that and just masking our ability to detect smells.
Most people who have problem with their sense of smell, it is due to some sort of blocking of the access of odors to the back of the nose where the nerve cells lie that actually detect the odors. Too much mucus flow, swollen sinuses, a variety of those kinds of things that block the air passages.
Tell me about the tactility of food. That's obviously a sense that exists out in the world and as part of the food eating experience. How does that interplay with what you do?
Well, I think that's part of why I've trained so much and why I'm still constantly studying, because the way in which you eat a flavor is going to determine the experience. Butter, for example, you spread softened butter on bread, the fat is going to hit the roof of the mouth, you're going to get a really strong aroma, but you put butter in a shortbread cookie, and it's going to be a completely different experience because now the butter has melted, it's been creamed with sugar, so it's going to fall in the middle of the palate. It's going to hit a different place, and the aroma is actually going to shift and change because now it's got caramelized sugar in there, the milk proteins in the butter has now caramelized, and so that's a texture. Butter that's been clarified and turned to ghee, now all of the water has been removed, and so it's going to behave completely differently on your taste. It's going to be less fatty actually and have a more clean taste, less aroma. So the tactility of food, of course, is always going to be there. Apple, you eat an apple. The crispness or applesauce or fresh apple juice, completely different because of the texture, the way it's going to fall on the palate, the way it's going to fall within that construct of between chest and crown of head, it's all going to fall differently too because you're going to lose the weight. Or pink peppercorns. So it's a pepper, but it doesn't fall as heavy in that vibrational scale because it's so floral. And so it's going to rise higher, even though it might be a little bit spicy. But if you crush it and put it on top of chocolate, completely different experience now, even though the aroma might still be the same.
In a way, it's kind of a revolutionary transhumanist thing to think about because you're really talking about designing what we like. It's akin to saying, like, not what is your favorite color, but what should you want to be your favorite color? If you could make yourself respond positively to anything, and you have to talk with the nutritionist. Okay, what should people want to have taste good? Should it be kale? Should it be sardines? Should it be algae? These are the questions that people are going to be faced with.
Right. And what's amazing is that that's been going on as long as humans were around, especially since the Industrial Revolution. Industries have tapped into that better than any individual field. And if you think about it, okay, let's give it an example so that there's a tangible example from modern era. It's not a stretch to talk to a high-level athlete, like a basketball player or something like that. I mean, if you ask Michael Jordan, were you born to play ball? Many will say yes, but that makes absolutely no sense because the species created basketball not too long ago.
Right. Right.
So everything is not external stimulus determining what we are meant to do. It's the other way around. We control so many variables, we don't even think about it. And if the timing and the environment's right, we make use out of them. And that's what agriculture does. That's what industry does. And that's what marketing does. And I'm not actually throwing anybody under the bus and saying, oh, this is wrong versus that is wrong. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying this is what we do all the time. This is something that we do naturally because we have just evolved to utilize variables that is presented to us. And we do that by developing ways to like them and make use of that evolutionarily, not the other way around. You're not born to like something. You're born and all these things come to you and then you develop a liking for it. So if that's true, we could do the same thing about sweet, bitter, savory, salty, and so on, and ingredients. And I know that's true because beyond science, just even anecdotally, I'm not the only one that likes a certain food now, whereas 10 years ago I could have puked. Same thing. These things evolve all the time to match the stimuli and the environmental cues. So if we could scientifically control that for a better desired outcome, like sustainability and clinical health-related issues, then we get to have our cake and eat it too, pun intended.
Do you think that there is the way that I could put on a pair of rose-colored glasses and walk around outside and see the world temporarily with my visual system altered in a way that I find pleasing? Might there be an analogous technology for something related to taste, sort of a short-term cosmetic way of tweaking our taste or flavor systems?
Yes, it already occurs naturally. There are compounds called miraculin, and it basically makes everything taste sweeter. And it's not FDA approved or anything yet, but basically what it does, it doesn't make sweet sweeter. What it does is it masks the bitter taste and it coats the tongue a certain way, coats the retronasal reception area inside your mouth and coats the tongue a certain way that it limits the bitter taste from what you eat to get coded into your brain to interpret. So when that happens, the brain naturally picks up the sweet and enhances that. So that's technically neuromodulation, but fairly harmless way. So things like that are, what I'm talking about in terms of changing flavors and flavor perception so that we could curb our appetite or increase our appetite.
When I was at the symposium and I was giving my talk, there was a professor there. He asked a question. He said, what if there aren't enough flavors? I mean, I just don't think that's possible. Pine needles on the ground. You can eat pine needles and they lend an aroma. You can make a meringue out of pine needles. Ones that have already turned, completely different aroma and flavor. Green, completely different, but they're completely edible. We wouldn't chew them up and eat them, but you can extract that flavor and that aroma out to create an experience. So we have flavors all around us that can be used to manipulate and communicate this experience for people. And there's so much there. We just don't actually consider it food normally. I mean, I consider everything food, so...
It sounds like what you're doing in your process is taking this audiovisual experience and sort of translating that into a taste or tactile experience. And it's weird to think what that mapping might look like. Like, do you have multiple choices where one audiovisual input could correspond to more than one kind of taste or less? Do you feel like you have forks in the road, multiple choices?
There could be, maybe, especially after working with Francois and his taste and molecules studies. So what was interesting about working with him and really getting to know his work is that there are certain compounds of molecules that exist in several things, right? So you can pair a Chardonnay with red meat if you combine these other foods that have a particular molecular construct that pairs with that grape. And so it's kind of the same thing. I mean, he's done it because he's the best sommelier in the world. So he's experiencing things in a particular way, but he moved into the science of that, where I experience those molecules just in my life. Like I'm taking them in and they're moving around and I get them and I can find the ones that match or the ones that compete or all of that. I just experience it normally, which is a little overwhelming. It's funny because Facebook, I can't stand the color of Facebook. That color blue is hideous to me. And I do not want to taste whatever that is.
So if Mark Zuckerberg called you up and said, hey, I want you to do a meal for Facebook, like the official Facebook cafeteria menu or something, would you then be forced to make a meal that you didn't like the taste of? Or is there a decision point there? Is there a middle path that could be true to your synesthetic experience and still taste good to you.
Man, I don't know why they picked that color. And apparently nobody seems to mind it because it was like this, everybody's going to love this color blue. But I think the problem is with that color is that it is flat. It is empty. It doesn't have a resonance that is moving. And maybe that's why they picked it, because it wouldn't offend anybody on the planet. But I think that's why it's so offensive, is that it really tells no story at all. And it would be a bad meal.
Okay.
You know, TV dinners back in the 80s with the aluminum little things that you baked in the oven, you couldn't microwave them. And you know how like the cherry cobbler would kind of bubble over into the corn? It kind of feels like that, where you can feel the metal as you're eating out of that. And that cherry is really sweet, but also thick and gooey. And then the corn is completely bland. It has no flavor. It's just texture at that point. That blue kind of tastes like that.
It was amazing hearing her talk and trying to figure out, sort of do the mental gymnastics. What would it be like to have your senses with crosstalk on between one another?
You're right. It's hard to imagine what that would be like. And there are only a handful of people in the world who are like that, or what are called gustatory synesthetes, where every sensation that they have, not only do you get the visual or auditory sensation along with it, you get that gustatory sensation of what that song tastes like or what that picture tastes like.
One of the things you hear a lot is that smell is more tied up with our sense of memory than other senses are. A, is that true? And B, if it is, do we have a sense of what morphologically within the brain makes that be the case?
One of the things that's different about smell from the other senses that's always trotted out when you start talking about these issues is the fact that there's one less, what we call synapse, one less step from one nerve cell to another on the way from the nose to the cortex of the brain, the cortical areas where consciousness resides. Smell, unlike all the other senses, doesn't go through this relay station called the thalamus in the brain. And so that may be part of the answer.
It is one of those rare instances where everybody is rooting for you. It's like everybody sort of has a dog in this race of wanting things to be able to taste better.
Everybody loves enjoying a meal. And I really got to say, humanity gets lost in science oftentimes. Humanity gets lost in healthcare provision oftentimes. And although we all know academically what it is that we're doing, it's very easy to forget why. And that why, I try to remind myself every day, is the simple things in life. Being able to enjoy a meal with your loved ones. Those are the divine moments that are the most human moments. And we completely take that for granted until something bad happens. And we are trying to change that. And we're trying to incorporate that knowledge base to do things for the individual patient and all the way to sustainability question for the species.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to doctors Tim McClintock and Dong Han, and to professional chef Taria Camarino for giving us that audio tour of the worlds of taste and smell, and to a lesser extent texture, and how these all combine to form our perception of flavor, something that I think most of us probably do not think about, not all that much, other than the sort of thumbs up, thumbs down on do I like the taste of this thing. Fascinating to think about all the potential applications. Could sense of taste be used as a diagnostic tool for neurological disorders? Could manipulations of people's experience of flavor lead to wild and sci-fi sorts of public health gains? Imagine if you could make something that was easily and cheaply grown and also healthy to produce, also taste really good. You've solved like 6 global problems at once. And also horrible but interesting to think about those people that have these rare conditions where their sense of taste or smell is misfiring, and you spend your days hallucinating bad smells that you can't get rid of. That sounds awful. It sounds like, a torture technique devised by a villain in an Austin Powers film, but lots of work to be done in neurogastronomy, certainly an opening field, a field I think with a lot of untapped areas of research and application. For a young person looking to get into the sciences and maybe stake a claim somewhere, seems like there might be a lot of fertile ground here. But now we're going to take a look at one of the world's most familiar smells and tastes, coffee, or in particular the caffeine molecule, and how that might affect our overall sense of taste in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So we've just been talking all about the sense of taste, and involved in the sense of taste are receptors for a compound called adenosine. Adenosine, among other things, is a compound that builds up in your brain while you're awake. And you could think of this as something akin to sand filling up an hourglass, and when that hourglass is full, then you get sleepy. The more adenosine in your brain's adenosine receptors, the sleepier you feel. They call this sleep pressure. And the caffeine molecule, it turns out, is shaped very similarly to the adenosine molecule, and caffeine can actually fit lock and key style into an adenosine receptor, keeping an actual adenosine molecule from getting in, not making the adenosine receptor say, hey, I've received my payload, I've got to start exhibiting sleep pressure. And that's the long and the short of why caffeine has the wakefulness effects that it does. While a caffeine molecule is in the adenosine receptors, it's gumming up the works and not allowing sleep pressure to build. But in an earlier finding by Robin Dando, who is an associate professor of food science at Cornell University, he saw that adenosine receptors are involved in the sense of taste. So he wondered, knowing that caffeine gets involved with our adenosine system, might drinking caffeine actually affect people's sense of taste as well? And according to his recent findings published in the Journal of Food Science, the answer seems to be yes. Caffeine's crowding its way into the adenosine receptors apparently not only fights sleep pressure, it also diminishes the ability to sense sweet tastes, says Dando. If you eat food directly after drinking a caffeinated coffee or other caffeinated drink, you will likely perceive food differently. This makes me think about things like Jolt Cola that have famously large amounts of both caffeine and sugars, wondering if maybe they had no choice but to jack up the sugar load so high because caffeine interferes with people's ability to sense sweetness. In Dando's study, which was a blind panel of coffee drinkers, people got one of two types of strong coffee, one of which was decaffeinated and the other had 200 milligrams of caffeine. Both types of coffee had sugar added, and the panelists that received the decaf coffee rated that coffee as more sweet, the panelists with the real coffee less sweet. They also asked people how alerted they felt after drinking the coffee, and there was no difference between the caffeine and the decaf groups, placebo effects apparently accounting for all the wakefulness felt in the non-caffeinated group, although that is a well-known thing. It takes about 20 minutes for caffeine to actually start having its real physiological effects, so that ability to just take a sip of coffee or to even smell coffee and get perked up by it, that is placebo, plain and simple learned behavior, which might at first blush make you wonder, well, why drink caffeine at all? But presumably, if somebody drank decaf every day and the physiological effects of caffeine never arrived to provide a after-the-fact endorsement for that placebo, then in time the smell of coffee, the taste of coffee, those things would stop having their perking effects, says Dando. Think Pavlov's dog. The act of drinking coffee with the aroma and the taste is usually followed by alertness, so our panelists felt alert even if the caffeine wasn't there.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so that was it for episode number 202. Thank you for hanging around with us until the very end. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find the links to everything that we discussed here up at smartdrugsmarts.com/202. And if you missed last week's episode, actually the last 2 weeks worth of episodes, we were doing something in honor of our bicentennial run, first 200 episodes. You can find both of those up at thesame.com/200 or /201 respectively. Useful if you want to take a trip down memory lane, or if you weren't a listener to the podcast at the time those came out, you don't want to go back for the full episode binge, but you might want to cherry pick an episode or two. Those episodes that we just did might give you a couple of ideas. In next week's episode number 203, we're very likely going to be looking at an African tree called moringa, which has a pretty nice biochemical resume. So I will see you back here for that. Same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week in the meantime, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not. And the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.